When a wedding month should have brought a family together, one father chose to call the bank to freeze his own daughter's life savings just to stop her from walking down the aisle. He thought financial ruin would force her to crawl back, but he had no idea she had already signed a global deal that made his entire inheritance look like pocket change. Welcome to Rose Revenge. I hope you're all having a peaceful morning. How is the weather where you are? Please drop a comment and let me know how you're doing today. I truly value our little chats. Today, we're walking through a story that reminded me. Your worth is never defined by someone who can't see your light, even if that person is your own father. Let's go back to where it all began, and I'll let Olivia tell you her story herself. The silver fork scraped against the fine china with a screech that set my teeth on edge, a sharp, metallic discordance in the otherwise hushed dining room of our Hamptons home. My father, Arthur, sat at the head of the mahogany table, methodically cutting into the medium-rare ribeye I had spent the last hour perfecting, just the way he liked it. I watched his hands, aged but still commanding, as he ignored the tension thick enough to choke the air between us. Across from me, the seat remained empty, a silent reminder that my sister, Isabella, was likely out celebrating her recent engagement with my father's credit card. I cleared my throat, my fingers tightening around my water glass until my knuckles turned white, though I kept my expression as smooth as the linen tablecloth. I told him that since Isabella and I were both planning our weddings for the same month, I had a proposal that made practical sense. I suggested we consider a double wedding, or at the very least, that I move my date slightly to coordinate our celebrations, which would significantly reduce the financial burden on him and streamline the logistics for our extended family. It was a gesture of olive branch and fiscal responsibility, rooted in the values of hard work and treading lightly on the family's resources that I thought he still respected. Arthur didn't look up immediately. He took a slow, deliberate bite of the steak, chewing with an agonizingly calm arrogance that made my stomach twist. When he finally set his utensils down, the clatter echoed like a gavel in a courtroom. He leaned back, his eyes cold and dismissive, looking at me as if I were a stranger pitching a low-budget business deal rather than his eldest daughter discussing the most important day of her life. He told me that the very idea was preposterous and that I was being utterly delusional if I thought for 1 second that he would allow me to dilute Isabella's moment. His voice was quiet, a patronizing drawl that cut deeper than any shout. He said that Isabella was the golden child of this family, the one who actually deserved a fairy tale, while I was simply the one who kept the books balanced. Then came the words that felt like a physical blow to my chest. He told me that for me to stand on the same stage as Isabella would be an insult to the very concept of a wedding dress. He said I lacked the grace, the light, and the status to be seen as her equal in the eyes of our social circle. I felt the blood drain from my face, a cold numbness spreading from my chest to my fingertips under the table, yet I did not blink. This was the silence of the abyss, the moment where you realize the person across from you doesn't just dislike your choices, they fundamentally despise your essence. I wanted to remind him of the 5 years I spent working 80-hour weeks to save his accounting firm when his health faltered, while Isabella was busy finding herself in the boutiques of Paris on his dime. But I knew the words would fall on deaf ears. He wasn't looking for a daughter. He was looking for a trophy. And in his eyes, I was just the scratched silver in the back of the cabinet. He continued, his tone shifting from dismissive to outright cruel. stating that my presence at Isabella's wedding would make the entire atmosphere awkward and off-brand for the family he had worked so hard to build. He was essentially erasing me from the family portrait before the ink was even dry. The finality in his voice was chilling as he reached for his wineglass, swirling the dark red liquid as if he had just settled a minor clerical error. He looked me dead in the eye and issued his decree. I was not allowed to appear at Isabella's wedding, nor was I to mention my own little ceremony in the same breath as hers. He told me to go find some quiet corner of the world to marry my fiancé, someone he barely acknowledged, and to stay out of the way of the real celebration. The arrogance was breathtaking, a towering wall of ego that left no room for my sacrifice or my happiness. I sat there, the taste of the steak I hadn't even touched turning to ash in my mouth, realizing that the man I had spent my life trying to protect was the very person who was now systematically dismantling my dignity. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I simply watched him, recording every flick of his wrist and every condescending smirk, tucking them away for a future he couldn't yet imagine. The dinner was over, but the war for my own life had just begun. The morning after that suffocating dinner, the air in the Hamptons felt heavy, as if the very atmosphere were conspiring with my father to keep me in my place. I stepped out into the crisp sunlight, determined to prove that his words were merely the ramblings of an arrogant man and not the boundaries of my reality. My first stop was the Gilded Lily, the only florist in town capable of handling the elegant, understated arrangements I envisioned. Mrs. Gable, a woman I had known for 15 years and whose accounts I had personally balanced during her shop's leanest winter, wouldn't even meet my eyes. She kept her hands busy with a bouquet of peonies, her voice trembling slightly as she told me that a sudden, massive corporate contract had just come in, occupying her entire staff for the next 3 months. It was a blatant lie, delivered with the practiced hesitation of someone who had been coached. I didn't press her. I simply nodded, the silence of the abyss settling over me once more as I realized the reach of my father's influence. The pattern repeated at the Harbor Bistro and even the small stationery shop on Main Street. At every turn, I was met with polite, rehearsed rejections. Gregory, the manager at the bistro, was the most transparent. He pulled me aside, his face etched with genuine regret, and whispered that my father had suggested it would be in the best interest of their professional relationship if they focused exclusively on Isabella's upcoming gala. Arthur wasn't just refusing to pay for my wedding. He was effectively erasing the possibility of it happening anywhere within 50 miles of his domain. He was using his reputation and his ledger books as a cage, ensuring that if I didn't play the role of the neglected, invisible daughter, I would have no role at all. I was sitting in my car, my hands gripping the steering wheel until they throbbed, when my phone buzzed in the cup holder. It was him. I didn't want to answer, but I knew that in this game of psychological chess, silence was my only weapon. But avoidance was a weakness. I picked up on the third ring. Arthur's voice came through the line, smooth and dripping with a patronizing satisfaction that made my skin crawl. He didn't ask how my day was. He simply, a dry, rasping sound. He told me that he hoped I was enjoying the local scenery, and remarked that it was a shame how busy everyone seemed to be lately. He said that in a community built on legacy and loyalty, people understand which side of the bread is buttered. Then, with a chilling lack of emotion, he added that I should stop this foolish little rebellion before I embarrassed myself further. To him, my desire for a life of my own was just a messy clerical error he was currently correcting. "I understand perfectly, Father," I said, my voice as cold and level as a frozen lake. I didn't give him the satisfaction of an argument. I didn't tell him he was being cruel or unfair. I hung up the phone and sat there for a long time, watching the waves of the Atlantic in the distance. The fear that had been fluttering in my stomach for weeks finally died, replaced by a hard, crystalline clarity. This was no longer just about a wedding or a dinner party. This was a battle for my own agency, a fight to prove that I existed outside of the shadow he cast. He thought he had walled me in, but he had forgotten one crucial detail. I was the one who had managed his accounts for half a decade. I knew exactly where the cracks in his walls were. I drove back to my small apartment, bypassed my desk, and went straight to the closet where I kept my old professional archives. I began digging through the folders from 3 years ago, past the tax returns and the audit reports, until I found a faded manila envelope tucked into the back of a drawer. Inside was a single, handwritten receipt in Italian, stamped with the seal of a private estate in Sicily. It was for a deposit I had made years ago, a just-in-case dream I had funded with my own private consulting fees, money Arthur didn't even know existed. I looked at the name on the receipt. Lorenzo. My father had successfully closed every door in New York, but he had no idea that I still held the key to a villa overlooking the Mediterranean. He wanted me to be small and isolated, but instead, he had just pushed me toward the only place where he had no power. I picked up my laptop and began to type my first email to Italy in years, the "Welcome home" already echoing in my mind. As the cursor blinked on my laptop screen, ready to send that email to Sicily, my eyes drifted to a framed photograph on my desk, a relic from 5 years ago. In the photo, I looked 10 years older than I do now, my face gaunt under the harsh fluorescent lights of my father's office, a stack of tax returns towering beside me like a paper fortress. That was the year Arthur's heart nearly failed him, and with it, the legacy he had built over 3 decades threatened to crumble into a pile of lawsuits and lost clients. While the doctors were telling him to rest, I was the one who stepped into the vacuum, trading my youth and my weekends for the survival of the firm. I remember the smell of stale coffee and the hum of the air conditioner at 3 in the morning, the only sounds in a building that had become my entire world. I didn't ask for a partner's salary or a fancy title. I simply did what needed to be done because that is what we were taught. Work hard, protect the family, and the reward will follow. I believed in the American dream, where merit was the only currency that mattered, and I thought my father believed in it too. Every Friday during those long, grueling months, I would process the wire transfers for Isabella's educational trips across Europe. While I was navigating complex audits and soothing panicked investors, my sister was posting sun-drenched photos from a yacht in the Mediterranean or a boutique in Milan, all funded by the very accounts I was working until my eyes bled to save. I remember one evening, when Arthur was finally strong enough to sit up in his study, I brought him the quarterly reports showing we were finally back in the black. I was exhausted, my hands shaking from too much caffeine and too little sleep, but I felt a surge of pride. I told him, quite simply, that I wasn't doing this for the money, but because I loved our family and wanted to see his life's work honored. He didn't offer a hug or even a genuine thank you. He just looked at the bottom line, nodded, and asked if I had remembered to send Isabella her extra allowance for her birthday weekend in Saint-Tropez. It was a moment of profound clarity, the kind that leaves you feeling hollow and cold inside. That was the first real crack in the foundation, a red flag I chose to ignore because the alternative was too painful to acknowledge at the time. I watched as he slowly regained his strength, not to mentor me or to prepare the firm for a future where I was a leader, but to resume his role as the architect of Isabella's perfect, effortless life. He began to treat my expertise as a clerical commodity, something he could tap into whenever he needed a problem solved, but something he would never publicly celebrate or reward. I was the engine room of the family, hidden and greasy, while Isabella was the polished chrome on the deck, shimmering in the sun for everyone to admire. The values of responsibility and self-reliance I held so dear seemed to only apply to me, while Isabella was granted a permanent pass from reality. I began to realize that my investment of a lifetime into the family business was actually a black hole, a place where my effort went in and Isabella's luxury came out. It was a bitter pill to swallow, realizing that the man I had saved saw me as nothing more than a highly efficient, invisible tool. I stood up from my desk and walked over to the bookshelf, pulling out an old leather-bound journal I hadn't opened in years. Inside were the notes I had kept during those midnight hours, not just accounting figures, but observations of the mistakes Arthur was making as he grew more arrogant and less careful with the law. I realized then that while I was saving him, I had also been learning exactly how to surpass him. My loyalty had been used against me, but that same loyalty had given me a front row seat to every vulnerability in his empire. I closed the journal with a soft thud, the sound echoing in the quiet room like a door locking behind me. The warmth that used to accompany my memories of the firm was gone, replaced by a hard, crystalline resolve. I looked back at the screen of my laptop, at the email addressed to Lorenzo in Sicily, and felt a strange sense of peace. The girl who worked herself to the bone for a thank you that never came was dead. The woman who was about to take back her life was just getting started. And this time, the investment would be entirely for herself. The journal wasn't just a record of my father's mistakes. It was the blueprint for my own liberation. While Arthur sat in his study, sipping expensive scotch and basking in the false sense of security I had provided him, I was living a double life. To him, I was the reliable, slightly drab accountant who lived for his approval and kept the gears of his empire turning without complaint. But in the quiet hours between midnight and 4 a.m, I was a high-stakes consultant for a network of international clients who valued my brain far more than my lineage. I had learned early on that in the world of high finance, information is the only real currency, and I was wealthier in that regard than my father could ever imagine. I built this network piece by piece, transaction by transaction, ensuring that every dollar I earned was tucked away in private accounts he couldn't touch and didn't even know existed. I remember the night I first spoke to Lorenzo, the man who would eventually become the key to my escape. He was a man of old-world grace facing a very new-world problem, a predatory legal maneuver aimed at stripping his family of their ancestral villa in Sicily. He had hired the most expensive law firms in Rome and London, yet they all told him the same thing. The contract was ironclad, and he would have to sell the land that had been in his family for 4 centuries. I took one look at the fine print, found the structural weakness in the holding company's tax filing, and drafted a counter strategy that turned the predators into the prey. I didn't do it for a massive fee. I did it because I respected the legacy he was trying to protect, a concept of heritage and hard work that my father only pretended to understand while he squandered our own. Lorenzo had offered me a blank check in his gratitude, but I had asked for something far more valuable: a standing invitation and a silent partnership in the estate's future. There is a profound, quiet thrill in being the invisible observer in your own life, acting as the silent architect of your own rescue. For 3 years, I played the part of the dutiful daughter, nodding at my father's patronizing advice while my own offshore portfolio grew in the shadows. I watched him waste the firm's hard-earned profits on Isabella's endless whims and luxury vacations, knowing that every cent he threw away was just another brick in the wall he was unwittingly building around himself. He thought he was the master of our universe, but he was merely a character in a story I was meticulously editing from the sidelines. My self-reliance wasn't a burden. It was my armor, forged from the very neglect he thought would keep me small. I didn't need his inheritance or his blessing, because I had built something that was entirely mine, something that no amount of local influence or Hampton's gossip could ever take away. This secret success was my ASMR for the brain, a private intellectual satisfaction that kept me warm when the dinner table at home grew cold and bitter. I had become an expert at playing the long game, a skill Arthur had forgotten in his old age and arrogance. As I gathered my digital receipts and prepared to close the door on this chapter of my life, I felt a sense of pride that had nothing to do with the family name. My father had spent his entire life trying to control the narrative of who I was, but he had forgotten that I was the one who controlled the data that kept his world spinning. I opened my encrypted email and composed a short 2-sentence message to Lorenzo, letting him know that the just-in-case dream was now a reality and that I would be arriving sooner than expected. I hit send, my heart beating with a steady, calm rhythm that replaced the old tremors of anxiety. I didn't need to shout or scream to be heard. My silence was the most powerful thing in the room. Exactly 5 minutes later, the notification chimed, a small sound that felt like the ringing of a liberation bell. The reply was simple and elegant. "Welcome home, Olivia." Those 3 words carried more genuine warmth and respect than anything my father had said to me in the last 25 years. The cracks in the family business were no longer my problem to fix. They were the windows through which I would watch the sunset over the Mediterranean. I was no longer a tool to be used. I was a woman with a plan, and the resources to execute it to perfection. The morning I was set to leave for Sicily, the air at John F. Kennedy International Airport felt sterile and indifferent, a stark contrast to the boiling tension I had left behind in the Hamptons. I stood at the check-in counter for my business class flight, the weight of my laptop bag a familiar comfort on my shoulder. I had everything planned: the secret accounts, the Sicilian villa, and a future that didn't involve balancing my father's books while he planned my sister's coronation. But Arthur was a man who didn't just want to win. He wanted to see his opponents crumble. And unfortunately, he still saw me as an opponent rather than a daughter. When I handed my primary credit card to the attendant, I felt a flicker of the old anxiety, the invisible observer in me sensing a shift in the wind. The attendant swiped the card, then swiped it again, her brow furrowing as a soft, rhythmic beep echoed in the terminal. She looked up at me with a polite, rehearsed sympathy, and informed me that the transaction had been declined by the issuing bank. I felt a cold drop of sweat trace a path down my spine, but I didn't let my expression flicker. I reached into my wallet and produced another card, the one linked to my private consulting fees. Again, the same rhythmic beep. Again, the same polite, "I'm sorry, ma'am." My heart began a frantic, uneven drumming against my ribs. I knew exactly what had happened. Arthur hadn't just used his influence with the local florist or the town baker. He had used his professional standing as a high-level accountant to report irregularities and financial risks associated with my Social Security number. He had flagged my accounts as part of a phantom audit, knowing that the bank would freeze my credit lines for at least 48 hours while they investigated. It was a surgical strike designed to leave me stranded, penniless, and forced to come crawling back to him for a plane ticket home. He wanted to prove that my American dream of self-reliance was a joke without his signature at the bottom of the check. I stepped away from the counter, my legs feeling like lead, and found a quiet corner near the window. For a moment, a wave of sheer, unadulterated terror washed over me, the emotional roller coaster plunging into a dark valley. I was 32 years old, an expert in international tax law, and I was standing in the middle of a terminal with $5 in cash and a mountain of frozen assets. I looked at my phone, seeing 3 missed calls from a private number I knew belonged to my father's office. He was waiting for the white flag. He was waiting for the submissive daughter to admit she couldn't survive in the real world without his shadow to protect her. But as I watched a plane lift off into the gray New York sky, the fear was replaced by a cold, crystalline fury. I realized that Arthur had made a fatal mistake. He had taught me how to find the loopholes, and he had forgotten that I wasn't just his accountant. I was his most successful student. I didn't call Arthur. I didn't call the bank to plead for my own money. Instead, I scrolled through my contacts until I found a name that would change the trajectory of this entire double wedding farce. Marcus, the lead producer at a major streaming network. We had been in talks for months about a documentary series on European heritage and the preservation of ancestral estates, using Lorenzo's villa as the pilot episode. I hit dial, my voice steady and devoid of the tremors that had plagued me just minutes before. When Marcus picked up, I didn't tell him I was broke or that my father was sabotaging me. I told him that the Sicily project was moving ahead of schedule, and that if they wanted exclusive behind-the-scenes access to a high society wedding at a 400-year-old estate, they needed to wire the first installment of the production fee immediately. I framed it as an intellectual satisfaction move, a strategic partnership rather than a plea for help. 15 minutes later, sitting on a hard plastic chair at gate B34, I watched my phone screen light up with a notification from a private international bank in Switzerland. The wire transfer had cleared, a sum that made my father's financial risk report look like a child's allowance. I walked back to the counter, not to the business class line, but to the first class desk. I didn't use a credit card this time. I used a digital wire transfer that bypassed the domestic banking system Arthur thought he controlled. As I handed over my passport, I felt a sense of rebirth that was almost physical. Arthur thought he had trapped me at the airport, but he had only succeeded in forcing me to activate my most powerful weapon. I was no longer just a bride-to-be fleeing a toxic family. I was a partner in a global media event. I looked at the "Welcome Home, Olivia" email from Lorenzo one last time and smiled. The plane hadn't even left the ground, and I had already won the first round of the war. The plane descended through a layer of soft, sun-drenched clouds, and as the wheels touched the tarmac at Falcone Borsellino Airport, the sterile, metallic chill of New York felt 1,000 years away. Stepping out of the cabin, I was immediately enveloped by the air of Sicily, a thick, intoxicating blend of sea salt, sun-baked earth, and the faint, sweet perfume of blossoming lemon groves. It was a sensory ASMR for the brain, a healing balm that began to soothe the jagged edges of the betrayal I had carried across the Atlantic. There was no frantic hustle here, no judgmental whispers of the Hamptons elite. Instead, there was the rhythmic chime of church bells in the distance, and the warm, golden light that seemed to turn even the ancient, crumbling stone into something precious. I took a deep breath, feeling the tension in my shoulders dissolve for the first time in months, replaced by a quiet, steady sense of rebirth. Waiting for me at the arrivals gate was Lorenzo, looking every bit the Sicilian aristocrat in a linen suit the color of weathered driftwood. When he saw me, he didn't just offer a polite nod. He took both of my hands in his eyes shining with a genuine, deep-seated respect that I had never received from my own father. He called me a savior of his family's heritage and welcomed me not as a client, but as a queen returning to her rightful domain. As we drove toward the estate in his vintage convertible, the wind whipping through my hair, he pointed out the rugged beauty of the coastline, the turquoise water of the Tyrrhenian Sea crashing against the dark volcanic rock. This was the Giuseppe's dream, a place where the American concept of hard work met the timeless elegance of Italian tradition. Lorenzo told me that the villa was fully prepared, and more importantly, that he had already coordinated with the local artisans who were eager to work on a project of such intellectual satisfaction and cultural significance. We arrived at the Villa Castellano just as the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and burnt orange. The estate was a masterpiece of Baroque architecture, its ancient stone walls whispering stories of 400 years of resilience. We sat on the terrace, overlooking the sprawling vineyards, with a glass of amber-colored Malvasia wine between us. I told Lorenzo about the Netflix deal, explaining that we weren't just hosting a wedding. We were creating a high-fidelity documentary about the intersection of marriage, heritage, and the American dream viewed through a European lens. He listened with an intensity that Arthur never possessed, nodding as I described how each frame would capture the meticulous craftsmanship of the local lace makers and the history etched into every tile of the villa. It was a strategic masterstroke. I was turning my personal exile into a global celebration of value, ensuring that my wedding would be preserved as a work of art rather than a family footnote. The air grew cooler as the first stars appeared, but I felt a warmth radiating from within, a sense of intellectual satisfaction that came from knowing I had outmaneuvered a man who thought he had stripped me of everything. Lorenzo raised his glass in a toast, his voice a low, gravelly hum that felt like a comfort. He said that in Sicily, they believe that the most beautiful flowers grow from the harshest soil, and that I was the living proof of that ancient wisdom. I realized then that my father's attempt to isolate me had backfired spectacularly. By cutting me off from the narrow, suffocating world of the Hamptons, he had inadvertently pushed me into a landscape of infinite possibility. I wasn't just a bride anymore. I was a producer, a strategist, and a woman who had finally found a home that valued her substance over her subservience. Just then, Marcus and his production crew arrived, their black equipment cases looking like sleek, modern artifacts against the rustic stone of the courtyard. They moved with a quiet, professional efficiency, setting up the lighting rigs that would soon illuminate the villa like a jewel in the Mediterranean night. I watched as the lead cinematographer adjusted his lens, focusing on the intricate carvings of the main gate. The small, red tally light on the side of the primary camera flickered to life, a tiny, glowing heartbeat in the darkness. It was the signal that the narrative was no longer in my father's hands. The world was about to see my story, not as a shadow of Isabella's, but as a brilliant, standalone masterpiece. I leaned back in my chair, the scent of jasmine heavy in the air, and for the first time in my life, I felt completely and utterly free. The Mediterranean moon hung like a silver coin over the terrace of Villa Castellano, casting long velvet shadows across the ancient stone floor where the Netflix crew was quietly setting up for the next day's shoot. I was just beginning to taste the liberation of the salt-thickened air when my phone vibrated against the iron table, a jarring, mechanical intrusion from a world I had already outgrown. I didn't need to look at the screen to know who it was. The rhythm of the buzz felt like a heavy, demanding hand on my shoulder. It was Arthur. For a moment, I considered letting it ring out into the night, but I realized that true intellectual satisfaction comes not from avoiding the enemy, but from letting him realize his weapons no longer have an edge. I answered on the fifth ring, my voice as calm and smooth as the sea below. "Olivia," he began, his voice carrying that familiar, patronizing weight that used to make me shrink in my seat. He didn't ask how I was or if I had even made it to Italy. He simply jumped straight into the transaction of control. He told me he had seen the recent activity on my accounts and assumed I was using whatever paltry savings I had left to fund this ridiculous tantrum in Sicily. He spoke as if he were reading a boring audit report, his tone dripping with the arrogance of a man who believes every person has a price tag. Then, he delivered what he clearly thought was the killing blow. He informed me that he was sitting in his study with his lawyer, and if I did not board the next flight back to New York and offer a public, sincere apology to Isabella for disrupting her wedding month, he would officially strike me from his will. He said I would be left with nothing but the clothes on my back and the debt of my own pride. I practiced the silence of the abyss, letting the quiet stretch across the Atlantic until I could hear the faint, agitated rasp of his breathing on the other end. I thought about the American dream he had always preached, the idea that hard work leads to success and that one must be self-reliant. I realized then that for Arthur, those were just words to keep me working 80-hour weeks while he treated inheritance like a leash. To him, a legacy was just a pile of money used to buy obedience. But to me, it was the character I had forged in the fire of his neglect. I didn't feel fear. I felt a profound, almost clinical pity for him. He was trying to threaten a woman who had already built her own empire in the dark, while he was busy polishing Isabella's plastic trophies. "Are you finished, Father?" I finally whispered, my tone so gentle it was almost a caress, which I knew would drive him to the brink of madness. I told him that he was welcome to give my portion of the inheritance to Isabella. In fact, I encouraged it, as she would likely need it once his accounting firm eventually collapsed under the weight of his own outdated ego. I explained that the diatribe of control he was currently reciting held no power here, because I had already secured a legacy that didn't require his signature or his approval. I told him that while he was busy counting his change and threatening me with a piece of paper, I was sitting on a terrace in Sicily with a global production team, turning my life into a story that would be told long after his ledger books had turned to dust. The explosion on the other end was predictable. A frantic, sputtering rage as he realized his weapon of last resort had misfired. He began to shout about loyalty and the silent generation values he claimed to represent, but I simply pulled the phone away from my ear, watching the red tally light on the Netflix camera flicker in the courtyard. I told him, quite simply, that he could keep his money and his shadow, for I had finally found the sun. "Goodbye, Arthur," I said, using his first name for the first time in my life. A sharp, cold severance of the cord that had bound us for 32 years. I cut the call before he could respond, the silence that followed feeling like a benediction. I looked out at the ocean, the waves rolling in with a timeless indifference power, and I knew that for the first time in my life, the only person I had to answer to was the woman staring back at me in the dark. Hi, everyone. I'm just taking a moment to process this. Arthur thinks money is the only way to hold his daughter captive. Have you ever had to choose between a financial safety net and your own dignity? I'd love to know what choice you made. Leave a comment below, and please give this video a like if you're proud of Olivia for standing her ground. Let's get back to the story. The morning of the ceremony arrived with a sky so blue it looked as though it had been painted by a master's brush. Yet beneath the beauty of the Sicilian sun, I felt a familiar, cold prickle of intuition. I was standing on the second-story balcony of the villa, watching the production crew finalize the lighting for the garden path, when a dusty black sedan pulled up to the ornate iron gates. This was not the catering van or the floral delivery I had been expecting. I watched, with the detached precision of an invisible observer, as a man stepped out of the vehicle, his posture stiff and out of place against the rolling hills of the vineyard. It was Arthur. He hadn't just called to threaten me. He had flown halfway across the world, driven by a blind, desperate need to reclaim the control that had slipped through his fingers like dry sand. I stood perfectly still, shielded by the stone balustrade, as he straightened his suit jacket with the same arrogant flick of the wrist I had seen 1,000 times in the Hamptons. He looked at the villa not with admiration for its history, but with the cold, calculating eye of a man trying to determine the price of a soul. He didn't ask for me. He walked straight toward the main office where Lorenzo was coordinating the day's logistics, his stride filled with the misplaced confidence of someone who truly believes that the American dream is just a synonym for the highest bidder. I moved quietly through the corridor, positioning myself in the shadows of the library that shared a connecting door with the office. I could hear Arthur's voice. It was loud, demanding, and utterly devoid of the respect this house deserved. He began by introducing himself as the patriarch of the family, speaking to Lorenzo as if he were a low-level clerk rather than a man whose lineage was etched into the very foundation of this province. He told Lorenzo that there had been a terrible misunderstanding, and that my presence here was a result of a family dispute that had spiraled out of control. He spoke of reputational risk and financial instability, using the same professional diction of expertise he had used to try and freeze my bank accounts just days before. Then came the bribe, delivered with a smugness that made my skin crawl even through the thick wooden door. Arthur told Lorenzo that whatever I was paying for this little production, he was prepared to triple it, on the condition that the contract was terminated immediately, and I was escorted off the property before the cameras could roll for the final ceremony. He spoke about a settlement fee and a bonus for discretion, treating my wedding and my hard-won partnership with Netflix as nothing more than a nuisance to be bought off and buried. I felt a momentary flare of the old anxiety, the emotional roller coaster, dipping as I wondered if even a man as honorable as Lorenzo could withstand that kind of financial pressure. After all, my father's offer was more money than some people in this region saw in a lifetime. I held my breath, the silence in the library feeling heavy and suffocating as I waited for the answer that would either secure my future or shatter it. But Lorenzo didn't interrupt. He practiced his own version of the silence of the abyss, letting Arthur's greed fill the room until the air was thick with the stench of it. I could almost see Arthur's chest swelling with pride, thinking he had found another person whose loyalty had a shelf life. He likely thought he was being shrewd and decisive, the two qualities he valued most in himself. He told Lorenzo that it was better for everyone involved to avoid the awkwardness of a public failure and suggested they handle the transaction in cash or a wire transfer to a private account. The sheer arrogance of it was breathtaking. Arthur was trying to use my own strategy against me, attempting to operate in the shadows to dismantle the very world I had built. He was so blinded by his own sense of superiority that he couldn't see the trap he was walking into. Nor did he realize that in this country, honor isn't something you can write a check for. The tension in the air was so sharp it felt like it could draw blood. I watched through the slight crack in the door as Lorenzo finally stood up from his desk. He didn't look angry. He looked disappointed, the way one might look at a child who had just broken a priceless vase without understanding its value. He moved toward the window, looking out at the garden where the Netflix crew was preparing to capture a story that would soon be seen by millions. He didn't answer Arthur's offer directly. Instead, he turned back with a small, inscrutable smile and gestured toward the leather chair across from his desk. He told my father that such a significant renegotiation required a formal review of the existing agreements and invited him to sit down while he pulled the necessary paperwork. Arthur sat, a look of ultimate triumph on his face, unaware that he was no longer the predator in this room. He was the one being observed, and the intellectual satisfaction of what was about to happen was a victory I had been preparing for since that first bitter dinner in the Hamptons. Lorenzo reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a heavy, leather-bound folder. But it wasn't the invoice Arthur was expecting to see. My father leaned forward, a predatory glint in his eyes, ready to sign whatever check would erase my existence from this island. But as Lorenzo flipped the first page, the smugness on Arthur's face began to evaporate like mist in the Sicilian sun. Lorenzo didn't show him a bill for flowers or catering. He showed him a global distribution agreement with the red N of Netflix embossed at the top. Lorenzo's voice was as smooth and ancient as the wine we had shared the night before, as he explained that the bribe Arthur was offering was merely pocket change compared to the media value and the long-term preservation of the estate this partnership guaranteed. He told my father with a quiet, devastating elegance that while Arthur saw this land as a commodity to be bought, Olivia saw it as a legacy to be saved. Lorenzo revealed the truth that had been hidden in the shadows for years, that it was I who had saved the Villa Castellano from a legal predator years ago. And in this house, Loyalty was a currency that no amount of American dollars could ever outbid. The silence that followed was the catharsis I had been waiting for since that first bitter dinner in the Hamptons. Arthur stared at the signature on the contract, my signature, written with the authority of a partner, not a daughter seeking permission. For the first time in my life, I watched my father shrink. The man who had always seemed like a giant, a ruler of his own small, suffocating kingdom, now looked small and remarkably fragile against the backdrop of 400 years of history. He realized that the invisible observer he had ignored for decades had not just been keeping his books, but building a world where he was completely irrelevant. This was the intellectual satisfaction of a woman who had played the long game and won, not through shouting or violence, but through the sheer, sharp force of her own intelligence. The arrogance that had sustained him for 60 years was gone, replaced by a hollow, stunned confusion as he finally understood that his influence ended at the water's edge of the Atlantic. I chose that exact moment to walk into the room, the silk of my wedding gown whispering against the stone floor like a soft, rhythmic warning. I didn't come to argue, and I certainly didn't come to seek his approval. I stood there in the golden light, draped in the very insult to a wedding dress he had accused me of being, and I had never felt more powerful. My father looked at me as if he were seeing a stranger, unable to reconcile the clerical commodity he had used for years with the radiant, sovereign woman standing before him. I practiced the technique of the slow reveal, letting him take in every detail of the custom lace and the ancient jewels Lorenzo's family had insisted I wear. I didn't raise my voice. Instead, I used the sharp, short sentences that cut through the air like a blade. I told him that the cameras were rolling, and the world was already watching a story that had no room for his bitterness. I stepped closer, my voice a cold, quiet whisper that carried more weight than any of his previous shouts. I told him that since he had traveled so far, I would offer him one final gesture of the American dream he so loved, the chance to be a guest at my wedding, provided he could find the grace to remain absolutely silent. I explained that he was no longer the patriarch or the provider. He was simply a man in a suit, sitting in a room that didn't belong to him, watching a daughter he never truly knew. The gloating was absolute as I saw the realization hit him that he was now the one who was off-brand and awkward in a space of true class and substance. I turned my back on him before he could find the words to respond, my mind already moving past his defeat and toward the celebration that was waiting for me in the garden. The war was over. The secret weapon had been deployed, and for the first time in 32 years, I was the one holding the pen for the final chapter. As I stepped out of the villa's shadow and into the brilliant Sicilian sunlight, the garden felt less like a wedding venue and more like a living masterpiece. The air was thick with the scent of 1,000 blooming jasmine flowers and the distant, rhythmic hum of the Mediterranean. But the true music was the quiet, professional click of the Netflix cameras capturing every second. I moved with a grace that felt entirely new, a rebirth that didn't need a father's hand or a sister's approval to be valid. This was the legendary wedding, an event that transcended the petty gossip of the Hamptons and became a global celebration of heritage, resilience, and the American dream realized on my own terms. Every detail, from the hand-sewn lace on my gown to the locally sourced vintage wine, whispered of a substance that Isabella's frantic, expensive planning could never replicate. While I stood there, a sovereign woman in my own right, my phone, tucked away in my bridesmaid's bag, vibrated with notifications I didn't need to read to understand. The double wedding conflict was over, but the contrast was only beginning. In the United States, the morning news was already beginning to trickle out, and the intellectual satisfaction of the outcome was absolute. Isabella's wedding in the Hamptons, which my father had poured hundreds of thousands of dollars into, was being treated as a footnote, a typical and uninspired display of excess that the media had seen 100 times before. Meanwhile, our Sicily project was trending worldwide as a must-watch cultural event. I didn't feel a surge of petty triumph or a need for revenge. Instead, I felt a profound sense of healing and peace. I wasn't trying to destroy my sister's day. I was simply existing in a light so bright that her manufactured glow couldn't hope to compete. This was the catharsis for every woman who had ever been told she was the invisible observer in her own family. My father, Arthur, stood in a far corner of the courtyard, his tall frame looking strangely diminished among the ancient olive trees. For 45 minutes, he watched me not as a subordinate, but as a person of immense value and power, finally realizing that in his arrogance, he had discarded his most talented child for a trophy that couldn't hold its own weight. The ceremony itself was a blur of golden light and genuine smiles, an emotional roller coaster that finally stayed at the summit. There were no scripted speeches of fake loyalty, only the words of a woman who had built her own foundation from the ruins of neglect. As the sun began to set, painting the villa in hues of deep gold and violet, I sat at a small rustic table near the edge of the terrace. Beside me sat Lorenzo and the head of production for the streaming network, their faces reflecting the success of the day. With a steady hand, I picked up the fountain pen and signed my name on a document that was worth more than any inheritance Arthur could have offered. It was a contract for a permanent equity stake in the Villa Castellano, purchased with the very production royalties I had negotiated in secret. I wasn't just a guest in Sicily anymore. I was an owner, a partner, and a guardian of a legacy I had earned through my own wisdom and self-reliance. Looking over at my father, I saw him take a slow, heavy sip of wine, his eyes fixed on the horizon as if he were trying to see all the way back to the Hamptons. He looked like a man who had finally reached the end of a very long, very wrong calculation. I didn't go to him to mock him or to demand an apology. I simply nodded once, a gesture of humanity and pity rather than anger. I had outgrown the need for his validation, and in doing so, I had finally become the woman I was always meant to be. The cameras began to wind down, and the guests moved toward the long tables laden with Sicilian delicacies, their laughter echoing against the 400-year-old stone. I stood up, feeling the cool evening breeze on my face, and realized that my American dream hadn't been about finding a place in my father's world. It was about having the courage to build a world of my own, one where the only thing that mattered was the truth of my own worth. 1 year has passed since the sun set over my wedding at Villa Castellano, and the seasons in Sicily have a way of turning that feels far more honest and rhythmic than the manicured, frozen expectations of the Hamptons. I am sitting on the same stone terrace today, but the perspective has shifted from a desperate need for survival to a deep, resonant peace that I never knew was possible. The Sicily project didn't just become a successful documentary. It launched my new career as a high-level producer of cultural narratives, proving that the American dream of self-reliance and hard work can thrive anywhere in the world if you have the courage to own your own worth. I am no longer the invisible observer or the hidden engine room in someone else's empire. I am finally the architect of my own. My days are now filled with the profound intellectual satisfaction of building something that will last, a legacy that isn't dependent on a signature and a cold will, but on the quality of my own character and the strength of the partnerships I have forged. I recently finalized the legal purchase of the sprawling olive grove adjacent to the villa, a piece of ancient land that is now officially mine, bought with the fruits of my own labor and the royalties from the very story my father tried to bury in the dark. The reports from my former life in New York reach me like muffled echoes from a distant, fading radio station, no longer capable of disturbing my quiet. Arthur's accounting firm, once the undisputed center of my universe, is reportedly struggling to maintain its relevance in a modern world that demands the very transparency and innovation he spent his entire life resisting. I heard through old professional colleagues that the golden child, Isabella, found that a marriage built on nothing but vanity and someone else's money is a fragile foundation, as her own ceremony has long since been forgotten by the very social circle she tried so hard to impress. When my father calls me now, which he does with a tentative, almost fragile persistence that was once unthinkable, I answer with a polite, measured distance. I don't feel the old, burning heat of anger or the cold, familiar shiver of fear anymore. Instead, I feel a quiet, humanizing pity for a man who spent his whole life measuring love in ledgers and found himself bankrupt of the only currency that truly matters. He asks about my life, and I share only the surface, keeping the sanctuary of my new world protected from the shadows of his need for control. This new chapter isn't about looking back with spite or holding on to the jagged shards of past betrayals. It is about walking forward with a heart that has finally been cured of the toxic need for an unearned inheritance. I have realized that the greatest receipt I ever collected wasn't a bank statement or a legal contract, but the bone-deep realization that I was always enough on my own. The silence of the abyss has been replaced by the rhythmic, healing language of the Mediterranean waves, a constant reminder that life is a series of powerful movements, and I have finally learned how to navigate them with grace. I no longer define myself by the countless sacrifices I made for a family that refused to see me, but by the immovable strength I found when I finally chose to see myself. My true inheritance is the freedom I breathe every single morning when I wake up to a view that I earned, standing on ground that I own, in a life that is entirely and unapologetically mine. As the golden hour begins to bathe the vineyards in a warm amber glow that seems to set the world on fire, I pull out a piece of heavy stationery and a fountain pen. I am sitting here, writing a letter to the woman I was 10 years ago, the girl with the tired eyes and the shaking hands, working until 3 in the morning in a dark, lonely office in the Hamptons. I tell her that the road ahead will be far harder than she imagines, and the betrayals will be deeper than she fears, but that every hour of invisible toil was actually a brick in the fortress of her future. I tell her that she doesn't need to wait for a thank you or a seat at a table that was never meant for her, because one day she will build her own table, overlooking a sea that knows no boundaries. I finish the letter with a single, steady sentence that carries the weight of my entire journey. You did it, Olivia. I fold the paper, not with a sense of an ending, but with the quiet, profound satisfaction of a story that has finally found its true, brilliant beginning. The sun sinks below the horizon, and for the first time in 33 years, I am not afraid of the dark. Watching Olivia find her strength under the Sicilian sun reminded me that sometimes the wind that tries to blow us down is the same wind that carries us to a better place. She didn't win by fighting. She won by growing. To all of you listening, your value isn't a line item in someone else's ledger. You are the architect of your own legacy. Don't let someone who treats you like an option make you forget that you are a masterpiece. How did Olivia's journey resonate with you? Have you ever had to build your own success from the ground up when family didn't believe in you? Please share your stories and the lessons you've learned in the comments. I read every single one of them. Thank you for being part of our community today. Until next time, stay strong and stay graceful.